Welcome to Short Course, episode 129 for May 10th, 2024. I'm your host, Ben Barry. It's been actually right at a month since the last episode, and there's a few reasons for that. One of the big ones is that we have been dealing with a fairly significant family medical crisis. My wife's mother has had a very significant stroke. We're very blessed that at two different points in the crisis, the medical intervention saved her life. And at this point, she's now on the long road to recovery, and she is in the process of attempting to rebuild as much as she can. Not to make someone else's story about us, but this has impacted us fairly substantially. Obviously, it's just hard to focus on other things when something like that's happening, but we've had to make alternate childcare arrangements. Steph and I have a 3-year-old daughter and a 10-month-old son, and her mother had been watching them during the week while we were working, and so we've had to make alternate childcare arrangements for them in very short order, and basically all of that has just consumed all of my focus outside of work for the last 3 weeks or so. So I was at the two sessions of the April. Well, the first session was at the end of April. The continuation session was at the beginning of May, but we'll call it the April USPSA board meeting. And I've been performing my duties outside of the actual meetings as well to some degree, but certainly at a diminished capacity. And we've just been reevaluating. So, this is also what's behind the announcement that some of you might have seen, that Steph, who has been the North Carolina section coordinator, so this will be her 6th year doing it. So she's basically she will be serving until the end of her 3rd 2-year term. But after that, she is not standing for re-election. And so the call is open for anyone from North Carolina that is interested in taking over to do so. And the good news there is this decision has been made in May, so we have basically until the end of the year to try and find someone who's interested and get them up to speed, do as much handover. Ideally, whoever it is would be able to shadow at the section match in September and see how everything's going, and just generally try and have a good handover now. The announcement is still floating around. I haven't seen or heard of any strong leads, but as you're listening to this, if you're in North Carolina and you know someone that you think would be well cut out to be either section coordinator or treasurer. So previously, the section nonprofit had someone serving in both roles. While Steph has been section coordinator, at one point there was one person who was interested in serving as secretary and treasurer, but due to some conflict of interest with his day job, I don't believe he was actually able to take on that position. And basically nobody else stepped forward interested in doing it, and to some degree it was easier just to kind of manage it all in house. But it definitely has been a lot of work, and she's also helped out very substantially with a lot of the logistics around the Area 6 match. So she's also helping out quite a bit there. So between being both section coordinator, section match director, and basically secretary treasurer for the section, and also helping out quite a bit with the area match, she's got a lot on her plate. And honestly, it was manageable up until now, but if nothing else, one of the other things that her mom, and we were grateful for this. If you look back on social media, I posted about this last year, about the fact that Steph and I were able to go off for the whole weekend, be down in Charlotte at Rowan. And this is for 3 years now, since we had our first kid. For all 3 years, we were able to leave first one and last year both kids with her mom for 4 days and nights, and just drive off to Charlotte and just do section stuff while her mom was able to watch the kids around the clock, which was a true blessing. But that it's looking like that chapter is past. So that's what's going on there. That's why Steph is stepping back from being section coordinator. Has nothing to do with USPSA politics. I'm still planning to stay area director, and she's helping quite a lot with that, but she's done what she can at the section level, and so now it's time to see if we can hand that off to someone else who can run with it and put their own spin on it. But that said, as I mentioned, and as the topic of this episode indicates, I did want to do a quick recap of not item by item, but just some commentary on the two halves of the April USPSA board meeting, which again, the first half was the fourth Monday in April, and then the continuation meeting was 2 weeks after that, which that was a discussion that we had within the board about whether to try and space the two meetings right on top of each other on successive weeks, or to have a 2-week break between them. And I advocated for having the break. If nothing else, it just gives us a little more time to have one meeting, put out the minutes for it, and then put together the agenda for the subsequent meeting and have them sort of operate as two separate meetings instead of just trying to stretch one agenda across two. In this case, I think the first meeting was 4 or 5 hours, and then the second meeting was about 3 hours. So given the amount of business that we've been covering, having 2 meetings a month it's what has happened every month since January. January had 2 meetings, February had 2 meetings, March had 2 meetings, now April has had 2 meetings. I think it'll probably continue. Ideally, they'll be shorter. It'd be nice if we could do 2 3-hour meetings a month and then continue to sort of whittle things down and get more business done asynchronously on the email chain and that sort of thing. So the meetings are more, hey, here's what we've discussed. Here's the final proposal. All right, let's vote on it. And then the meeting is basically where the recorded vote happens, but a lot of the discussion, not for secrecy reasons, but just for productivity reasons, happens asynchronously among the board. And then if there is a disagreement, then we can air that disagreement during the live streamed board meeting. But and actually, it's funny. I'll come back to this, but Andy Erickson, who is now the Area 3 director, that was actually one of the questions that he had for me when we talked a few days before he started his term is how does stuff get done? Where does the discussion actually happen? And I said, yeah, that's it's funny you ask that, because I would like to see more happening via email, but it tends to be that things get stuck on the agenda and maybe there's some material that's sent out ahead of the meeting, but we aren't really in a good pattern where people are expected to come prepared. We're getting there. In fact, just before I hit record on this, I saw that Yimin had just sent out a recurring calendar invite, not just for the board meetings themselves, but for the deadline to have your supporting materials submitted for any committees or directors who will be making a report during the meeting. And that deadline is the Wednesday before the meeting. So 5 days before the meeting, which I think is fairly good. It gives you the weekend before the meeting. And then if you have any questions, particularly for the employees, you can ask those questions and they can answer Monday. And then hopefully you have answers to your questions. And then the meeting Monday night is just hashing out the final details. So not just expressing that, but also just, again, it's a calendar invite. I'm not trying to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but moving towards doing these things that are just procedural. It's just about not even really addressing the business itself, but addressing how the business gets done, establishing these practices and these habits, really processes, building those things up where in the past they didn't really exist. And so I think, as weird as it sounds, I think little things like that are actually moving the organization in the right direction, so that even as people come and go, as long as these processes are followed, hopefully we'll still continue to have a good outcome from whoever is in that seat going forward. But all of that said, the April meeting kicked off with a bunch of executive session stuff, and basically the first thing that happened in open session was we came back from discussing the legal opinion that we'd gotten from the Delaware law firm in executive session. And without going into too much detail on that, I will say it was not a slam dunk conclusive, this bylaw is illegal, you have to reinstate Scott Arnberg, no questions asked. Absolutely. If it had been, if we had voted to start a program where we were selling drugs or something, doing something illegal, at any point, any member can raise a point of order, which point of order in Robert's rules is just the sort of interruption of business to bring up the fact that at some level, either the rules of the assembly or the laws of the country, or the rules of the assembly, the bylaws of the organization, or the laws of the country, in that order, right? They all have to obey the step above them. One of those three levels of the rules are being broken. And so a point of order can be something like, hey, we're voting on a motion that hasn't had a second. That would be a very technical point of order. Or you could say, hey, we voted to do something that's illegal. That would be that very sort of highest level point of order. And so if 7-7, the bylaw that was used to remove Scott Arnberg, was obviously and demonstrably illegal, then you could make a point of order and the president can rule on it. And then any two members of the assembly can raise an appeal if they disagree with the president's vote or the president's ruling, and then it goes to a majority vote of the assembly. So on any kind of contested point of order, it'll almost always end up being a majority vote of the assembly. And as I mentioned in previous podcasts, I didn't see a good grounds within the bylaws for calling a point of order. Now, what ended up happening at this May meeting was Frank called a point of order on what I thought was the best argument to be made, which was basically that at the meeting in December where 7-7 was invoked to remove Scott, the vote was 6 yeses, 1 no, Frank, and 1 forced abstention, Scott. But even if Scott had been allowed to vote, it would have been a 6-2 vote, which passes this is where things get sticky. And I've said this before on the podcast back in January and I think December. I was talking about this idea of whether 6 votes met the 3/4 threshold. And reading more about Robert's rules, doing more research, rereading the bylaws, it is my view that the way that the number of votes is tabulated is based on the number of seated directors. So if you had, in Robert's rules, a quorum to conduct business is a majority. So if you have 9 members seated, you can have a quorum and conduct business with 5. And then the bylaws state that any motion, unless it states otherwise, requires a majority vote of the board members present. So in this hypothetical meeting where you had 9 members on the board, but only 5 showed up, or heck, there was an example, a special meeting was called over a technicality, basically just authorizing a contract that we'll get to later, and only 6 of us were there. But 6 was a quorum. We were able to vote unanimously to approve the contract. So we didn't, because it was a special meeting scheduled on 48 hours notice, we only got 6 or 7 of us, but that was enough to conduct business because all it required was a majority vote of those present. There are other bylaws, which include 10.2 as well as 7.7. So 10.2 is the bylaw around confidentiality that allows waiving that confidentiality with a 3/4 vote of the board. Not the board present, but the board seated. So there's the theoretical maximum number of votes on the board, which is 9. There's the number of actual members of the board, which in the case of December and up until just now has varied between 6 and 8. But in December of 2023, it was 8. And then there's the number of board members present. And it is my reading of the bylaws that 10.2 and 7.7, when they refer to 3/4 of the board, they mean the board seated. So basically, vacancies don't count as abstentions. So if we look at the vote in 2023 in December, Bruce Gary had resigned from the board. There were 8 votes on the board, and 3/4 of 8 is 6. If Bruce Gary had not resigned, but he had simply been absent from the meeting, then 6 votes would not have been enough because his abstention, effectively, through his absence, would have not added a yes vote to get to the 7 yeses required. But because he resigned instead of being absent, because at the time of that vote, the board, in my reading of things and the general understanding, The board was 8 members, 6 yeses was enough. Do I like that outcome? No. Do I wish that Scott had not been removed from the board? Yes. But we dragged this out into April. And so I appreciated that Frank made that point of order. And he said, 6 votes does not meet the threshold of 3/4 of the board. Now, I noted on the meeting, at this particular meeting in April, we had 8 members of the board seated. So we had 8 votes in play. And we voted to waive 10.2, which uses exactly the same language as 7.7. It says 3/4 majority of the board. We had voted to waive 10.2 in a 6-2 vote. So earlier in that meeting, we had said 6 votes is enough to meet a 3/4 majority when there are 8 votes on the board. And nobody had raised a point of order. But I appreciated that he raised it. Everybody got to kind of put their cards out on the table and discuss the issue. And as was basically expected, the point of order was not well received. Frank appealed, and it went to a vote, and the vote failed. And that was basically, that was, if anything was going to bring Scott back, that would have been it. And it didn't get the votes. And right after that, I did move forward with a bylaw amendment that I had proposed that just removed the lifetime prohibition on ever serving as a director or president of USPSA after having been removed under 7.7. So effectively, this would allow Scott to either run again, or if the elected Area 3, Andy Erickson, had decided to resign, then Scott could be appointed to the seat if that was who the section coordinators in his area recommended. But that bylaw also failed. It was a pretty high bar. It required amending the bylaws also requires a 3/4 majority. So in this case, we would have needed 6 yes votes, and I think we had 2. So those were kind of the 2 plays. They both didn't land, but at this point, as much as I don't like that it happened, I think it was time that we needed to move on and move forward. And so right after that I think after Frank's point of order failed, he made the motion to go ahead and set the start date for Andy Erickson, he and Luke Faust put their name in to both run for Area 3, and Luke Faust had withdrawn from the election once it was just the 2 of them in it, so that Andy would be the uncontested winner and could be seated as expediently as possible, which is now done. And so his Andy's start date was set for a week from that meeting, just to give us time to get everything set up. And so Andy is now on the board, and he is serving out the end of the term that originally Matt Hopkins was elected for. So the term from 2022 to the end of 2025. So yeah, 22, 23, 24, 25. Yeah, that 4-year term. So Matt Hopkins was elected to that term, resigned. Scott won a special election. Scott served, and then Scott was removed by 7.7. And now Andy is in for basically all of 2024 and 2025. So the topic after that was member discipline. And again, we went into executive session, came back out, and the votes, which you can see in the minutes, were to suspend Mark Stamper as a USPSA member, first for a period of 6 months. That vote failed. And then for a period of 3 months, that vote also failed. And at that point, it was pretty clear that there was no appetite for this, and we just moved on. And I just want to clarify. I don't like people saying nasty stuff on the internet. I wouldn't defend what Mark said, but I think as soon as we go down this road, as soon as it said, okay, what Mark did is worth 3 or 6, whatever the number is, we say, all right, we put a notch on the wall and say, this type of offense will get you this level of punishment. Now, that'll be the mark that, no pun intended, that'll be the judgment by which all other speech is judged. Oh, is this worse than what Mark said or better? Is this worse or better? Worse or better? and we'll just go down this road of chasing people anywhere on the internet, not emailing, not directly reaching out to members of the board, but just posting things, and we'll just be chasing our tail. And so my no vote to suspend Mark was not an endorsement of his behavior, but it was a recognition of the fact that we have a ton of more important things to be doing. And at the end of the day, trying to chase down people acting this way online, ultimately the goal, the purpose, what we need to do is fix the underlying problems so that people don't feel the need to act out in this way. Now, yes, some people will always just be mean and nasty on the internet. You can't stop that. It's the internet. But my vote was not a vote of approval, as some people are construing it. I'm not defending him. I'm not making excuses for him. I am just trying to take the larger perspective that if we start going down this road, it'll never end. And instead, we should be focusing on actually fixing the organizational health of the business. So after that vote ended, then we went on to some other procedural things that honestly it was good to cover them, but they weren't really of wide-ranging strategic value. The one thing that I think is useful to call out from the minutes is the vote to spin off the Historical Preservation Committee into its own separate organization. And this vote makes more sense in the context that came out after this meeting, which is the announcement that Donna Webb is leaving her position as managing director of USPSA. And actually, May 10th, the day that I'm recording this, was her last day. And one of the things that she was and is passionate about is this historical preservation side of things. The committee was always set up with no budget. The idea was it would operate within USPSA, but it would be entirely donation funded. So it was always a strange fit in the organization anyway. And so the idea is with Donna moving on, she now can take the money that's been donated for this purpose and all of the photos and memorabilia and what have you that's been donated, and that will be transferred to a new 501c3 nonprofit historical preservation society that she is setting up. And she'll be able to do whatever she wants with that. And it'll be outside the USPSA umbrella now. So some people were saying after the announcement and some of this discussion that Donna was staying involved with USPSA in this historical role. No, if you look at the April meeting minutes from the first session, it's clear the board voted to spin that off into its own separate organization. So not that it's not important. I think this history is very important. And I hope that we can have a good repository for collecting the artifacts. And, to me, going back and watching Nationals footage and World Shoot footage from the 90s and the 2000s, and heck, I'd watch earlier stuff if I can find it. It's all, the way the sport evolved is very interesting to me. But right now, it's just, we got to get the ship in order. It's not really something that we can prioritize. Now, hopefully in the future, when we're in a good position, if this Historical Preservation Society is able to kind of pull something together and become a self-sustaining entity, it's something that, and I'm just speaking purely speculatively, there's been zero discussion of this, but hopefully it's something that we can support in the future. But I would not want to commit to anything like that. I personally think history, if you don't curate it and make sure to pay attention to it, it just dries up and blows away. So I do think this is a useful thing to be doing. And I wish Donna all the success in that enterprise, and I hope everything is a big success. And I have no hard feelings toward her. I wish her all the best in the future. And I hope we as an organization and a membership, we can learn from the past and just move forward and leave the past in the past, and just let her move on and do her thing. And I think that's the best that we can do. And I'm certainly happy to do that. So we have started the process of looking for a new managing director. The board is very aware that we have to make substantial changes, and also while we're doing that, try and bring on a new leader of the organization. But we're committed to taking the time to do it right. It's not something where we're looking to just get a stack of 3 resumes and pick one and hire that person just to get somebody in the chair as quickly as possible. We've engaged a headhunting firm. We've put up the job posting on our website. So if you know someone who you think would be a good fit, not necessarily someone who has any background in USPSA or shooting, ideally it's someone who is more well-versed in running nonprofit organizations and the day-to-day requirements and legal compliance and just all the more of the business keeping the trains running on time type emphasis. And there are people out there. I mean, this is an industry, this is a profession. And so if we can find someone who's, managed anything adjacent to 501c3, I mean, there are a lot of nonprofits out there. And so I think hopefully we can find someone who brings that experience and can help us put things into shape. But we're realistic that it'll be months before we make an offer to someone, and that we need to be able to sustainably run the business until then, so that we have the ability to take the time and let the process take as long as it takes to find the right person. So that is ongoing. And I do think this does mark a turning point. Obviously, there's still a ton of work to do, not least in sort of onboarding the new managing director when we find one. But the giant container ship that is USPSA continues to turn slowly, but continues to turn. The continuation meeting that happened a week and a half ago, as I'm recording this at the beginning of May, was primarily to go over the draft budget that Donna had put together and approve it after reviewing it and asking questions. And it had been sent out in advance, so we'd had a chance to look over it, ask questions via email, which was all very productive. And that a high level summary of that should be posted with the minutes as I'm recording this on Friday night. And it's a mixed bag. So it does show a slight profit, I think in the neighborhood of 50, 60,000, something like that. So a slight profit, which I think is realistic. I still don't like the way that the member dues increase happened last year. And I think for a lot of folks, that's going to cause them to not renew. But you can't deny the math that for the folks that do renew, charging them more, it definitely will help pad the top line, right? The revenue part of the P&L. And so I think by increasing revenue, but also significantly cutting costs, even with a line item expecting to lose 300,000 on nationals, basically split between the 4 nationals, World Speed Shoot, and then the 3 USPSA nationals that we're producing in-house, then we are still showing a modest profit. Will we hit that exactly? I'm realistic enough to know that one of the ongoing things that we'll still be working on this year is getting the financial tracking more dialed in so that we actually know where the money is going and getting it coded in the right budget categories. And then as soon as this budget gets put in, the goal is to then break that down into monthly budgets and actually be able to track progress both month by month and then sort of against the year. So by the end of June, we'll be 6 months through the year. Which budget items are we tracking at more than 50% spent? And if it's something that is front loaded, something that we buy a bunch of in February and then use throughout the year, well, then that's okay. But to actually give us the ability not just to write the budget down and then write the budget in March and then look at it next January, but to actually ideally keep an eye on it and monitor how we're tracking against it throughout the year. Not by any means rocket science, revolutionary type management theory, but just something, just basically practice that, as far as I'm aware, that is not the way business had been done. And so just trying to bring that kind of accountability so that ideally every month at the board meeting, we can review, hey, here's where we're at relative to the budget in all 30, 40, whatever, how many expense lines we have the budget broken out into, and all the different codes and QuickBooks and everything. So it is still a work in progress. I will not say this budget is perfect, but I think it is better than last year's. I think it is relatively realistic, and I think it gives us the foundation to make 2025 a real success. One thing that is worth mentioning is so all the budget discussion was in executive session. This is, and I agreed with Ken Cobb when he brought up the point of, why does this have to be an executive session? What is so secret in here? And I mentioned during the meeting that, well, the way 10.2 is written, all financial information is still supposed to be kept confidential. And I've talked to Frank about this, as he's the chair. I'm the vice chair of the bylaws committee. This is something that we want to address, that unless there's something highly sensitive in the financials, for example, individual salaries, right? That's a typical thing that's not included, but a sum of the salaries for everyone in the company. Yeah, that's reasonable to know. And that's included in the high level summary that'll be posted alongside the minutes of the second half of the meeting. But I think going forward, the board as it exists has the default that is encoded in the bylaws, as well as to some degree in the culture of the board, of keeping everything secret by default unless we're legally obligated to release it or the members basically drag it out of us. I think that is dying. And, even someone like Ken Cobb, who I disagree with on a lot of things, and he's taken a lot of heat, the fact that he was the one voice standing up and saying, why do we have to put this in executive session? He's right. And I think hopefully going forward, this is something, especially with the new managing director, we can basically have the culture be one of a default to openness. There are certain things that for specific reasons have to be kept confidential, but everything else should be prepared in a way that we can distribute it to the membership. And I think having new board members, having new managing director will be the opportunity to reset that culture. And I already see it happening. I already see the fact that, heck, take, for example, both halves of this meeting. The vote to waive live streaming, or to waive 10.2 to allow live streaming, was a 6-2 vote. So 3/4 of the board was on board with the transparency of live streaming what was ultimately some pretty boring meetings, which ideally they would all be pretty boring. There were parts that were particularly spicy, but for the most part, the assumption is, hey, let's do this out in the open with our hands above the table and not have anything to hide, because, and again, this is more me speaking, but just my perspective on it is, it's not our money, it's the members' money. We're just trying to direct it into useful places to go. But this idea that we should default to secrecy has got to go. And I think it is going. And so while this budget, I do think the budget that we're sharing in 2024 is a step in the right direction. Hopefully the 2025 budget will be more correct in the sense of actually measuring even more closely what we actually spend money on and why, and also be able to be more detailed, ideally almost to the level of the financials that we release. And that is also in progress. So one of the things I brought up on the meeting was, can we release the 2023 financials alongside the budget, just so people can look and see what we spent in 23 and what we're budgeting in 24 and judge for themselves how reasonable those are. That is still ongoing. The process of having those financials reviewed, so basically sending all of our accounting information to an accounting firm and having them look over it. They're not auditing. We only do an audit every third year. And last year, 2022 was an audit year. So 2023, they're just reviewing the data. So basically it's a level of scrutiny thing. They're not scrutinizing the data as intensely. They're just looking and making sure, hey, all the numbers that we're sending them add up, where an audit is obviously more of an audit. But anyway, the reviewed financials are still in progress, but they are well along that progress. And as soon as we have them back, I want to get them posted so everybody can see, hey, here's what we actually took in and spent last year, and here's where we're at. And you do with that information what you think is appropriate. So that is coming, but we're following the process. We haven't had the conversation yet if we can start moving that information up earlier into the year. Obviously, not having your 2023 financials absolutely set until May of the following year is a rough situation to be in. But again, I think this is the kind of thing that will continue to move slowly, but I think we can continue to make progress on. And this episode's already running long, so I won't belabor too much. But the last item that we talked about was a social media policy, which was basically a cleaned up and rewritten version of the existing social media policy, but it just based on some discussions within the board about sort of expanding the scope of the social media policy. It was written up and presented, and we discussed it, and it didn't get enough votes to pass. And so basically it just went poof. Maybe people will keep bringing it up, and someone will rewrite the rewrite and come up with a draft that's acceptable enough to get 5 out of 9 votes, since we now have 9 votes on the board, with Andy joining us at the second half of the meeting. But I kind of doubt it. It'll be interesting to see how that progresses. But if nothing else, it was a good discussion about the fact that I was able to raise an issue, which I brought up via email a few times. But the fact that we're kind of using social media to do 2 things. One is marketing, where we're basically trying to sell USPSA to people who aren't already members. And then communication, where we're trying to use social media to communicate with the members, the existing members. And so trying to figure out, to me, well, yeah, that's, there are a lot of different ways to skin that cat, but I think drawing that dichotomy, right? Because one of the concerns with social media is there are people who have posted on the official USPSA pages and gotten blocked from it. And then when a video announcement from Yimin is posted to one of those places, they can't see it there. So what is the alternative for that? And do we need to clarify what are we doing with social media? And so we didn't really dive too deep into that discussion, but I sort of raised that, and I think that's something we're going to have to figure out. But the policy was presented by Area 1 Jim Boone, who did win his special election, so he will be serving also through the end of 2025. So he will be serving out the latter 2 years of the term that Bruce Gary started at the same time that Hopkins started his term. And Jim Boone wrote the policy, but ended up voting against it. But it was more of just a good faith attempt to say, hey, if we're going to do this, this is what it'll look like. Let's talk about this so we can either pass something or stop talking about it. So we'll see where that goes. But that was why that one was a bit of a strange agenda item, because it's weird to have someone present a policy and then vote against their own policy. But that's basically how the conversation went. So that is all I've got. I would hopefully, well, I won't make any promises, but hopefully I can get back to more regular, shorter podcasts. Going a month between episodes was not the plan by any stretch. But there is also some actual real board business. We're starting to get down to things. I think we're spending less time sort of chasing phantoms and hunting witches. And hopefully we can actually start really spending time taking a hard look at the bylaws, figuring out what things need to change, actually looking at real member discipline for actual incidents of cheating and the like, and getting down to looking at the rules and actually addressing, making real changes to the organization, not just kind of going down side trails and following distractions. Hopefully we can actually start making progress like that. So we are at the beginning of the 5th month of the year. We've completed 4 months. We've had 4 sets of meetings, right? Each month it's been 2 separate meetings, but in those 4 months, I think a lot has happened. A lot will continue to happen. And I just appreciate everybody out there listening. I appreciate all the folks who have emailed or sent a message, and just let me know what you want to see. I mean, the main thing that I hear is, more transparency on the finances, and actually having a little more understanding on how things actually get done, why decisions get made a certain way. And so I'm working towards those, but now that it seems like things are actually starting to move and we've got everybody seated on the board. Everybody has an area director they can now write to. Although, I still hear from folks in other areas saying, yeah, my director doesn't really represent me. So, can you look into this? I'm happy to take those emails as well. But yeah, let me know kind of where you see the biggest needs are out there. I obviously have a list of things in my head that I think are a priority. Let me know what you think about limited optics. So that's on the agenda for the May board meeting, because limited optics was ratified as a provisional division in 2023, and it's now been a year. So basically, we now have the choice to renew it for another 12 months or modify it and renew it, or let it elapse, which I don't see happening. I mean, obviously, limited optics is here to stay. The only real question is, what is it going to look like, and how different is it going to be from carry optics? And so I would, obviously I have my own personal thoughts on that, but I would love to hear yours, whether you live in Area 6 or not. So I do think we are at an inflection point. I think it's worth remembering that, as busy as it seems, we're only 4 months into the year. We've only completed 4 months of the year. And in that time, there's been goodness knows how much upheaval. And so I really am optimistic. I really do feel like things are turning around, and I hope you guys out there see some signs of hope. But if you're still protesting, no hard feelings. We still have a lot of work to do. We certainly would appreciate the renewing your membership or paying activity fees. But if you still don't feel that the USPSA represents you, and then we still have more work to do. Well, that wraps up this episode of Short Course. If you want to get in touch with me, my email is ben@berryshooting.com or area6@uspsa.org. Talk to you next time.